So I'm looking forward to this session this morning. So leading teaching and learning through data, it's sort of an interesting contrast with some of the stuff we've been talking about earlier on. But I think Ian's journey through the University at Coventry is actually quite one that chimes with the developing of the future leadership of institutions, etc. So I think it's quite an interesting journey. So I'll stop there, conscious of time, and I'll hand straight over to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invite. It's always a worrying experience to face so many experts. However, I just want to, before I introduce myself properly, I just want to make two comments, if I may, to the last conversation, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. One, some people may know we have a campus in Scarborough. People normally say to me, why Scarborough? They never say why Chongqing, but they always say why Scarborough. Anyway, I'll explain that in a moment. The point is, I was in conversation with the station manager, station lead for GCHQ Scarborough, with whom we work very closely. And he was talking about his need to recruit people. They have 800 specialists, data security specialists in Scarborough. And how do you recruit at £35,000 a year, people who effectively could be earning at least 100,000 in the big cities? So I thought the point about quality of life and about what HE has to offer, it was really fascinating. And I think we must not undersell the opportunities we have to sell a quality of life. Having sold a quality of life experience type of question, however, we have to live it and we have to make it real. And so we have to make sure that people do have that quality of life. I also thought the comment about the best technologists don't always make the best managers, I thought sums up the higher education sector rather well. And the best academics certainly don't always make the best academic managers, as I'm about, I think, to demonstrate. So I'm Ian Dunn, I'm Provost at Coventry. I've been at Coventry for the whole of my working life, 27 years so far, hopefully for a few more yet. I've had huge opportunity to do all sorts of interesting things. So whenever anyone says to me, gosh, one place all that time, isn't that rather narrow and limiting? No, it's not. If you've done lots of stuff in one place, it's just as exciting as doing the same thing in lots of different places. So I have to say, it's been a really fantastic time. I'm an engineering academic. I had the great opportunity to lead our engineering faculty for a while before I took up the role of Pro Vice-Chancellor for Student Empowerment in 2010, subsequently becoming Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Student Experience and more recently, Provost. Provost, by the way, means I try to look after the research, teaching and knowledge transfer, all of the academic endeavour of the university, which is quite an interesting new challenge. The point for explaining my short career history is the Pro Vice-Chancellor part for student empowerment was really important. As Dean of Faculty of Engineering, I, in my regular updates with our then Vice-Chancellor, Madeleine Atkins, used to say, we're not managing the data. We're just not looking at, we've got this fantastic source of information, and we're not managing it. And I did that every week in my regular updates with her. And after about 6 months, she said, well, I've had enough of this, just get on with it, and gave me the job, which absolutely wasn't my ambition at all. I really liked being the Dean of Engineering, and I didn't want to do this. But anyway, so the whole of this talk is going to be about some trends in higher education, my thoughts about where things are going, and the role of data in managing the learning experience of our students. And I've got a couple of pleas I want to make to you for your support and for your engagement with this agenda, please, because I think this is it's one of those moments where we in the academic leadership roles have to understand that this is a collaboration and a cooperation, and we've got to build together rather than sort of have these grand expectations and then say to you, please, can you deliver that for us? It's completely not going to happen. The same has happened in the whole of the estates world, and the way in which we design and conceive of education buildings has fundamentally changed. It's now much more, it's not oh, estates department, please build me a new faculty building. It's absolutely now an endeavour that's across the institution and built from within. We don't yet, I don't think, conceive of our IT estate in quite that way, and it's absolutely something that we must do if we're going to transform the educational landscape, IT landscape. So, I am going to focus on 4 themes. I'm going to just reflect on a few trends, one principal trend in global higher education, a few comments about how I believe we need to transform our digital and IT estate, and I'd particularly like to make a few comments, personal experience comments, about working with educational technology startups. And there are, as you will know better than I, many of them out there. I take 5 meetings a week, and I'm really not joking, at least 5 meetings a week with new startups who are trying to sell me the answer to everything. And quite often they've got some really great ideas, but how do we bring all of that together is the question. I then want to focus particularly on data-led learning and what that might mean for a student experience in a digital world, a truly digital world. But let's start with this, the UNESCO projections for higher education. We have about 200 million seats in higher education right now across the globe. The UN, UNESCO, are projecting that by 2040, that needs to have more than doubled. As you see, or perhaps you see, the big coloured bits are different regions around the world, and East Asia and the Pacific are absolutely the massive part of that growth. That won't surprise anyone at all, down to population growth, down to development of wealth and prosperity, and it sort of feels like it makes sense. However, I pop those 5 institutions onto the screen. That's 1,160 years of higher education. By the way, those numbers of students weren't the numbers when they started. They are the numbers now in those institutions which continue to exist. So that's something like 123,000, 125,000 people in those 5 universities. Basically, what I'm saying is it's taken us 1,160 years to create the first 200 million places in higher education. If we think we're going to physically build the next 200 million spaces on campuses over the next 20 years, I think we're going to be well, broke, even more broke actually than we currently are. The way in which those spaces in higher education are created to fulfill that demand is going to be different. And technology and online learning is absolutely going to be a very important part of that. I contrast those 123,000 places in those very ancient universities, and yes, they've got a different mission. Yes, they do fantastic things. And I'm not in any way suggesting these things are going to disappear. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is, campus-based higher education plays one part. You know, the boarding school model that we perpetuate in the UK, particularly. Of higher education, you go away to university, is absolutely going to continue, and it will work for some people. Almost all of our institutions know that we have a very significant number of commuting students for whom the boarding school model is already broken. It's not the way in which they engage with higher education. And even some of the institutions that would probably see themselves, or we would see as being very much more based on that sort of model, you know, the research elite, have very significant commuting populations. And that's a second group of students. But the third group, it's definitely on the increase, is the online learners. You know, those of you that are aware of the higher education system in the US will know that something like 1/3 of all master's degrees are now delivered fully online in the US. And that undoubtedly is going to start to serve more of our undergraduates too, in a way. However, there is a big question that we have to think about. It is the value that is placed and the esteem that is given to those places in that sort of mode of learning. What we can't afford to do, I would argue, is to allow multiple tracks of higher education to emerge that are seen more or less highly, and some of which are regarded as less positive. Because if we do that, we will be creating a hugely discriminatory system that serves the less well-off population, or those that can afford least to go away to that boarding school model, not well at all. I work very closely with a very dear friend, Paul LeBlanc, who's president of Southern New Hampshire University. For those of you that know Paul, or if you don't know Paul, I'd recommend you get to know him. He's an utterly fascinating character and a beguiling character. SNUI, Southern New Hampshire University. He normally introduces it by saying, people in New Hampshire don't know where Manchester, New Hampshire is, so why should the rest of the world? They have 3,000 students on a private non-profit campus in Manchester. It's very attractive New England sort of territory. They have 135,000 fully online learners, and Paul now claims to be the largest single US institution. It is quite something to behold in the way in which they've built that endeavour. Some of which you will definitely not approve of, some of which I don't approve of, but you know, there are things there that are going on which I think are really worth having a look at. So, that's just to set the scene from a global trends perspective. What I'd like to now just make a few reference to are the need for us to transform our digital estate, the way in which we conceive and build our systems, the way in which we procure our systems, and procurement has certainly been mentioned already, which is great. My principal point here is we're really, I was going to say really good, we're really not bad at the corporate systems, you know, the big systems which come from big organizations, the big enterprise type systems. We may not always implement them particularly well, but we're pretty good at getting hold of them and then starting to implement them and making them ultimately work. My point is going to be that the learning infrastructure is a very different case. It's a very different sort of type of ecosystem. These are often systems that are much smaller in construction. They're smaller organizations. The way in which we buy them, the way in which we build things onto those systems is really very different. And actually, we pay far too little attention to our central and core business, which is the teaching and learning infrastructure. And we don't actually really invest in what we're all about. We build our organizations as corporates, but we don't build our organizations around the principal line of activity, or one of the two principal lines of activity. So what I'm arguing for is, yes, let's get those corporate systems right. Let's get our HR systems and our finance systems and our student record systems and our CRMs and all of those things absolutely important. But let's think about how we position them in that learning infrastructure, and then place as much emphasis on the learning environments and the way in which our students perceive of their journey through the university. And let's not forget about the social and co-curricular environments that we need to create. Our students are fundamentally different now to when I was a student, which is some time ago, but I would argue that they're also fundamentally different to even 5 years ago. The transformation, the change in which, the way in which our students work and operate and learn now is so different. It's only 2 or 3 years ago that I managed finally to persuade one of my academic colleagues to stop saying, please switch off your laptops and mobile phones as they go into a lecture theatre. And now to start to realize that if I go into a lecture hall with 200 students, there will be at least 300 or 400 devices active as I go in, and I will be challenged on what I'm saying in that lecture, and that is a fantastic opportunity for me to be really tested, and for me to demonstrate that my students are engaged in learning. So I think we have to place as much emphasis on the last two parts of that list as we do on the first two. And I absolutely will say that my institution is as guilty as I'm sure many others of spending enormous amounts of time discussing how we implement, do we transform our student record system? Do we move to something that's going to cost us an enormous amount of money? And I know there are people here who sell those things, so I have to be a little bit careful. That's fantastic, and absolutely we need a student record system. But my former Vice-Chancellor once said to me when we were setting up one of our subsidiary companies, learning companies, Coventry University College Limited, and we were having trouble with the IT infrastructure that we were going to. How do you have, within one organisation, multiple learning entities, the university, Coventry University College Limited, Coventry University London Campus Limited, Coventry University Online Limited, all as separate entities, and how do we share the IT infrastructure? And her words to me, she isn't known as a huge enthusiast necessarily for all that's IT. She said, get a ledger and a pen, and we can keep the record on a piece of paper. You don't need this stuff. She wasn't right, but I understood the point, and the point was really, really important. It's not the student record system that means that we're going to deliver a fantastic student experience and a student learning experience. Those sorts of things are simply something that we need to do in order to keep the record of the learning journey. So, I'm very clear that the technology that we use is there to support learning, is to enrich and to enhance the learning journey, and not simply for the sake of the technology. So, my plea to all of the edtech startups that try and sell me things every day of the week is, don't sell me the technology, sell me the enhancement and the opportunity it brings to my learner. I also want to talk a little bit about the way in which we try and support our students in that journey. So not just about the learning, but also about their well-being and their general sort of general experience. I'm sure we're all thinking about this, but it is about the multitude of solutions that we offer to students. The wayfinding app, the timetabling app, the volunteering app, the app from the careers service, the solutions from all over the place. And then we complain about the fact that no one's really logged into these things for a very long time. Well, let's make it possible for them to log in. Let's make it all part of a journey. Let's think about what we're trying to offer to the students, and let's actually connect the things together. So really, I'm arguing for this idea of an ecosystem of products that are connected, that we plug in and we plug out, and we absolutely just bring the best in class. And we are brave enough to be able to get rid of it. But let's design from the very beginning for them to be able to be plugged in and plugged out. The next point is about the data and the way in which we have this enormously rich data set about our students and about their learning and about their engagement with us. And largely, I think we don't make very much of it. Now, I'm sure some people are much further down the line than others. We have taken a very focused approach to making sure that we have what we call in Coventry, what I call Project OVT, one version of the truth. Our Director of Planning doesn't really like it being called one version of the truth because it sort of winds people up. But what we're saying to people is, stop creating your own spreadsheets, stop creating your own data sets, hand over your data, but in handing over your data, let's pile it into our data warehouse, in order that we can see if there are patterns which emerge that are useful for other things that we aren't yet aware. But in order to ask them to hand over that data, we absolutely say to them, we must give you something back. We've got to give you a tool that allows you to visualize what that really means so that you don't need to collect your own data. And we can also, and for those of you, I'm sure, familiar with academic committees where you turn up and a piece of data is presented and then 3 people stand up and say, well, I disagree with that. And actually what they're doing is disagreeing with, they've collected their own data that says something quite different, and being able to say to them, that's just delightful, but forget it. It just doesn't matter. This is the data that's published. This is the data that is out there. So whatever you're saying is, let's sort out the underlying problem. Let's not argue about the data set. So we have to be able to provide them with a tool. And at Coventry, we now have, I'm very pleased to say, we started from teaching and learning and have spread backwards into the corporate systems. That was more by happenstance than by design, but it's been great. So we have dashboards and approaches and a democratization of data to course teams, to course directors, that present them dashboards that allow them to compare the performance of their course on a very detailed basis. Yes, to do with student satisfaction, to do with module evaluation, to do with retention and all of that sort of stuff, jobs, but also to compare with benchmark data across the sector. And by doing that, it means that we've been able to put in place a data-led reapproval process, so that we don't any longer require every course to turn up, irrespective of whether it's performing brilliantly or really not well, every 5 or 6 years in a quality cycle to be reapproved. We can now actually say, after a year, your data really isn't great. You know, we don't want to inflict this sort of performance on another cohort of students. Unless we can put this right, then we're going to have to do something about redesigning or pulling this course. And equally, for the course that's doing brilliantly and has continued to do brilliantly, we can simply say, you've got green lights in every box, big tick, get on with it, you know, that's fantastic. And that's so much more effective than, it means that we can focus our resource on course design in a very different sort of way. The rest of my few minutes is going to be talking about how we take that into a much more personalized learning approach. And I'd like to talk, oh sorry, yes, I hadn't done any pictures, so I thought I'd have to pop a picture in. Learning environments, and I'm sure most of us, with all respect to our colleagues, and we've been a Moodle user for quite a long time. Coventry was one of the, I think, the first UK institution to go whole institution for one learning environment. In '97, WebCT, people remember WebCT. Yes, there are the other solutions out there, and I realize I've missed D2L, but anyway. And that's fantastic. But I rather see our virtual learning environments right now as a bit like a glass cylinder into which we pour students and content, and they never get out. Yet they live their lives in social media terms in conversations across the network, you know, the Slack and all of those sorts of things. And I see Charles sort of nodding at the back end from LinkedIn. Sorry, Charles. They absolutely are living their lives in a completely different way. How do we create that facilitative and that collaborative conversation across those environments? Why should a mathematics student not be in conversation about some aspect of learning with a student from philosophy or from the nursing courses? It just doesn't make a great deal of sense. And so how we reposition and how we rethink how this all fits together, I think, is really, really important, and something that we're working hard on right now to try and break down. I just wanted to pick up this quote. I think it is featured in Eric Stoller's Inside Higher Ed blog. You know, we're looking at our online learning experiences, and yet our students are looking at their lives in a very different sort of way. So they were great, and they've been great, and there's still great things with them. But time to move on, please. So, learner analytics, student engagement. Many of you will be working on the fantastic JISC project. You may be working with other providers of learner analytics. We certainly have. We have a very specific approach at Coventry. We use a particular piece of software streamed from Solution Path at the moment, which is fantastic. It gives us a student engagement dashboard. Student engagement is super. That means that we build on attendance data and on the use of library and submission of coursework and all of those other engagement points. And we develop an indication about the students' levels of engagement in their course compared to their cohort. Many universities then choose to make that data available to the student or to the tutor, and that, I think, is the weakness in the system, I'm afraid. It sort of needs more than that simple nudge. That's good, but we need to go a little bit further. In Coventry, we established a contact centre. That's by voice, by WhatsApp, or whatever means that the students opted for. So we send our engagement data to some people who we train, some student advisors, and they get on the phone and they talk to our students and they say, we're a bit worried, you know, your engagement doesn't seem to be matching. Is there something going on in life that we need to know about, that we can help you with? Would you like to meet up with your personal tutor? Can we set up an appointment? And by doing that, I can demonstrate really quickly, within the first year of doing it, even though we don't have all of the associated bits around it to make it easy, that we save 400 students in one academic year. 400 students who would typically have dropped out were nudged back into engagement and have gone on to be successful in that year of study. That, I think, is fantastic, because none of our students turn up with the intention of, I'm just going to turn up and then drop out. Doesn't really happen these days. Equally, that student engagement centre has been fundamentally important in reducing what I believe the Americans would refer to as summer melt, a term I'm not particularly fond of, but that's the students. So at Coventry, going back a couple of years, I had 10,007 students who were firm choice, going to definitely come to Coventry, 9,006 of whom actually turned up. 1,001 dropped out during that summer period, 10% or thereabouts. By focusing the student engagement centre on those people, we will be able to reduce by 35% that dropout rate, and so 350 students more turned up than perhaps would have done previously. Student engagement, absolutely fantastic, but it's only the beginning of a journey. It's only the very first bit of what I'm really interested in. Learner analytics, a little bit of data about that we already hold, so let's make use of. Now let's move on to data for learning. Let's actually think about how we use learning information to really promote engagement with study. What do I mean by that? Well, how much time does a student spend on a piece of content? How much time in a particular resource? Have they actually made use of that particular book or text or video or whatever resource I've made available? Data point number one. At Coventry, we've just changed our assessment process so that we have now core assessments and applied core assessments. Core are simply about testing whether someone knows something, understands a principle or not. Pass-fail. And it means that I can introduce a rapid test as I introduce a concept, automated test, to test whether a student understands a principle. Rather than waiting for 10 weeks for the examination or the coursework to be submitted to tell them that they didn't understand, I can now start to understand their confidence levels about their learning. And what I'm hoping that we can work on very quickly is to make sure that those points come together, and we use some clever data science to understand what that means in terms of, the session sponsored by AWS, so I make reference to the Amazon approach here, that you seem to find this interesting. So what about going off and studying this? Let's personalize in an automated sense. Take the student off into something that they find fascinating. More importantly, I think, is you seem to find this really tough. You seem to find this challenging. Here's some foundation knowledge that might help you underpin that, so that I can personalize and I can scaffold the student in that sense. And the third route, which I think is even more challenging, is to say your learning pathway. You seem to follow this sort of rather safe mode of learning, this learning style. I'm going to push you into this mode of learning now in order to broaden the way in which you understand the subject. That will be really exciting, and I look forward to working on that. So that's a second step, I think, for our learner analytics to move on to. And the third piece is data for well-being, about personalizing the support. So we're in conversation with our students at the moment about how we, with their permission, take their social media feeds and their broader engagement in order that we can pick up any sort of indication that anxiety or stress is setting in at certain points, and that we can then start to personalize the well-being support that we're able to offer them. That's where we need to bring the clinical psychologists and the data scientists and all sorts of other people together in order to try and do something I think that will be rather more exciting. And on top of all of that is to make sure that the data-led governance point is simply to say, I have to be able to reassure, and you'll all understand this, that the boards of universities are now under much more pressure to understand what's going on in much more detail than they've ever been before. And so being able to provide them with a view, I think, is going to be really important too. So, to bring all of this together, we have a growing demand for higher education, a massively growing demand for higher education. Modes of learning we need to move on quickly. We live in a very cottage industry-led sector, 30,000 higher education institutions. I'm an engineer, I come from the automotive industry. There aren't 30,000 automotive manufacturers any longer, but Volkswagen have many brands under that big umbrella. Is that something that's going to start to happen in the higher education sector? And certainly it's not dissimilar to the arguments that have been advanced by the Office of Students at the moment about the consolidation and about the change in the higher education sector. That doesn't mean that we need to lose any of our individuality and our personality, but it does mean that we need to be more efficient in the way in which we deliver certain supports and services. We need to develop much more accessible and affordable modes of education. The need for our students to be able to upskill and reskill as their careers become enormously long is absolutely part of this. So the way in which we open up our learning and then make it available to them in both that paid for and that free experience sort of way, the way in which we provide the digital credentialing route to allow them to build their educational portfolio is really important. And I'll make reference again to some work that I'm doing with Paul LeBlanc and Scott Rawls, who's the president of the North Virginian Community College network, and with Amazon in Seattle, looking at how those clever data scientists can come together to look at the jobs market, to look at the skills market, to look at the way in which higher education and the marketplace can all come together, and how can we navigate someone in a very data-led way through their career and provide them with the access to the skills and learning that they need in order to move from one industry to another over time. And something else that I'm really interested in that conversation, and it really is at the very beginnings of a conversation, how do we deliver the $100 a month degree course? How do we provide truly affordable higher education, not to the 100 students or the 1,000 students that we may have on one of our campuses, but to the 1 million or 5 million learners? The learner who's 30 years of age, who lives in Mexico City, who has to continue work because they're paying the family to live and to eat, but needs to move on wants to move on in their education. And they're certainly not going to travel the 2 or 3 hours across Mexico City each evening after work in order to get the education. How do we provide them with a quality higher education offer that is that's accessible and of the quality that means that they're going to get into the jobs that they wish to continue in? Finally, my future of learning. The argument I'm advancing to my academic colleagues is we really have to finally move away from this concept that we are the content producers. We produce a fraction of 1% of the content that we deliver to our students. We present the content. We are the curators of that content, but we are not the producers. How we facilitate that journey is really, really important. This is sort of flipped 2.0, to use that sort of hideous expression. This is using content from a very wide range of sources. So how can those clever data science people actually take the fake news agenda and turn it round and say, this is a really great and well thought through piece. I'm going to be able to feed that to a student without a member of academic staff having to filter it. How can I feed that into my learners? How do I support my learners in making sure that they are properly connected and that they get a unified view of the university? Not just the learning, not just the administration, but their extra and co-curricular activity. And how do I facilitate the acceleration and the flexibility of pathways through their learning in order to make sure that it fits with the point in life? Because a 30-year-old learner, an 18-year-old learner, and a retired learner are all learning for very different reasons. That doesn't mean the content that I have is not applicable to all of them, but it does mean how I present it and how I offer it to them has to be changed. And so my argument is that we need to bring together, please, the learning environment. We need to treat the learning estate as at least as important as all those corporate systems, and I would argue as more important than all of those corporate systems. And having done so, we then need to make sure that we have the conversation with our students, both current and future, and get out and find out who those might be, in order to make sure that we are designing for the way in which they wish to appreciate their learning. Thank you very much. I hope that was somewhat useful. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
We've got a little bit of time for some questions, so if there's anybody on the floor wants to ask Ian any questions.
Feel free to be abusive as well, please.
Despite encouragement, I'm not going to be abusive.
Oh.
That was very interesting, thank you. I mean, the question in my mind is what advice do you have, or what experiences have you had in your institution of actually driving the changes that you're talking about through your academic community? I'm specifically thinking about the fact that you talk about the fact that we're quite good at managing our corporate systems, and I sense that, and you're right, there's we strongly control our corporate systems, and we spend a lot of time focusing on them, and then it's sort of the degree to which things are embedded peters out as you get closer towards the heart of what's important to an academic community.
Yeah.
And you know, our corporate systems in general understand that you've got a degree program that's chunked into modules, and we force people to give it a code and a name, and then what happens within that is sort of we sort of leave that up to the academics, which historically has been where the dividing line is between the corporate systems and what goes on within the classroom. And we're necessarily, if we are embracing your vision of the future, which I think is a good vision of the future, we're necessarily requiring a greater degree of standardization in the way things are organized, because you can't programmatically do the people who succeeded at this went on and studied this, people who found this difficult went on. You can't do that unless there's a greater degree of standardization of the units of concept that are delivered within a module, or the units of the lumps of learning. And I just have no idea how we're going to take that next step and say, right, this module that we previously said, right, there's 30 credits or 15 credits, and you decide how that is delivered and how that's examined. How do we regularize that?
It's a really interesting question, and one that I muse on a great deal. I would argue that the word module is the biggest part of the problem in that situation. We've built around modules. At Coventry, we started 10 years ago to dismantle a modular scheme in the narrow sense of what that means. We still have modules, but modules that are elements within a course. And the students choose to come and study courses with us. You know, the idea that modules can be picked up by anyone, I mean, we're designing for the tiny percentage around the edges. The vast majority take a standard route almost through that. So let's design there first of all. Actually, what we're really talking about is the content and the way in which we organise, and the vessels into which we put that content. So I'll be really frank, we created Coventry University Online a year and a half ago, and we're working with FutureLearn to build a MOOC-based like approach, so MOOCs and SPOCs, some in front of a paywall and some behind a paywall, some in front of a paywall. Ultimately, I'd like to make all of our content available free and open. The way in which we tag that and put that into repositories, I think, is ultimately beneficial to academic staff, because I have dozens of people teaching 101 marketing in healthcare, in project management, in engineering, in marketing, in all sorts of bits of the institution, and they all do it in isolation and separately. What a waste of effort and what a waste of their own time. So what I'm using is trying to turn around the academic freedom conversation to say, I'm absolutely not going to challenge academic freedom, but make this available and tag it so that it's available to everyone. It sort of exposes it, as in any academic community, to academic scrutiny. And I think that will help in terms of quality also, because we then don't have to have a heavy quality system that sits on top. We can actually use our own academics to sort of assure that quality. And the fact it's exposed to the world makes it rather more robustly challenged. So that's all part of, that's a sort of the subject organisation bit. I think the bigger part of the question is about the people management and about managing the academic staff community. I know, compared to many institutions, I work very closely with my colleagues up the road in Warwick, and the academic organisation of our two institutions is fundamentally different. Warwick, built on that 1960s sort of model of true academic freedom in each school, is, my counterpart, Chris Enyu, up at Warwick, doesn't wander into each of her 34 schools and say, you will do it this way, because 33 of them will walk out at that moment. Because of where we came from, we have perhaps a somewhat more centrally controlled approach. I don't think that diminishes academic freedom. I think it's just a conversation and time that we have to build that. And also making sure that the student voice is front and centre. So the evaluation, in a positive way, we evaluate modules, we don't evaluate staff by students, but obviously staff deliver modules, so there is some sort of connection. And making sure that that feedback is very clear, and that we build a culture of having to feed back to our students. So if a student is simply saying, not making your content available to me on the online learning environment is just not acceptable. I need to be able to see this to be able to review it. Then ultimately that feeds in, and that conversation has to be had. And developing strong leadership, distributed leadership through the academic systems is also part of what we've done. So that's about 4 answers to that question.
Thanks.
One last question from Heidi.
So I think, Ian, all of us in the room probably agree with everything that you've said, but I think you have articulated the nub of the problem. The nub of the problem is the way academics are organised, managed and behave, and that we would love it if there was easier ways to change things with the way academics deliver courses, teach. I mean, the University of York, the conversations that go on around some of the changes that appear to us to be trivial types of things. You're 6 months down the line and 57 committee papers and an argument over a semicolon. I mean, it's... So I think what we would like is more academic leadership to change the way some of these things go on, because the technology can follow. The technology is only, designed in the way it is to support what the business is doing at the moment. So if you can move things forward, that would be great. And do it for all the universities, please.
Mea culpa. I disagree that that the systems are the way they are because of the way in which we're academically organised. I think there are two points of attack here, but I completely accept the academic leadership question. It is to refute absolutely that this is an attack on academic freedom. The ability to do bizarre things in your own module just because I'm the academic delivering that module is absolutely not about academic freedom. Academic freedom is about ideas and thoughts and to present the controversial. We conflate all all sorts of things into an academic freedom argument that we just have to we have to call out and say, stop it. That's not on. And yeah, that is a big thing, because it will cause some people to shout a lot. But yeah, so I'm with you. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much, Ian. Could I just ask you to express your appreciation for Ian? I have to say, and this got to be a shout out to Sally and the conference committee, that it's been really refreshing coming to a conference where we have IT people coming in and talking about human skills and change and culture, and as you described yourself, Ian, an academic engineer, provost of a university, coming in talking about data and technology. That is fantastic for a conference like this. We're just about to break for refreshments. We're due back at 11:50.